the intros were in the different order in which you sat. So let's just start there. Why don't you say the company that you work at and what you do there?
Of course. So I'm Sally Bolig. I work at Etsy, and I lead the global employer brand effort. We are a mighty team of 2 that do that today.
And I'm Maggie Hulce, the GM of Enterprise at Indeed. I lead the product and technology teams and go-to-market teams for our enterprise business at Indeed. Pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks. As a geriatric millennial, I'm a big cable watcher, and you both have great commercials, Etsy and Indeed. But we have a very global audience online. So what is Etsy and what is Indeed? Let's start there.
Oh, great. Should have practiced my Etsy pitch in particular. Yeah. So Etsy, for those who don't know, is a place to buy handcrafted goods, specifically from small entrepreneurs, typically. So you think about wanting to support small businesses while buying beautiful, one-of-a-kind items that you likely could never find anywhere else. You can find those on Etsy.
And Indeed is one of the world's leading job sites. We have 250 million unique visitors who come to Indeed every day to search for jobs, upload resumes, take assessments, and even interview with employers directly. 3 million employers use the platform. 20 hires are made per minute on Indeed, just to give you a sense of the scale.
And one of the reasons I'm so excited for this conversation is because you both see this issue, the war for technical talent, if you will, but through different angles and different sides. And so let's just start there. You know, a generous way of putting what this sort of period we're in is there's a lot of ebb and flow with the economy. There's a lot of uncertainty. But one thing that companies seem to always talk about, regardless of those macro factors, is that technical folks are hard to hire. Why do you think that is relative to other types of roles?
You go first.
So, well, one of the things we noticed looking at sort of job trends on Indeed, and again, Indeed aggregates jobs, all the jobs that are online are on Indeed. So we can see macro trends in category growth, industry growth. So we were looking at sort of category growth for tech talent broadly, and jobs in technical roles are up almost 50% this year, year to date. But the job seekers engaging with those jobs up only half that rate. So it's one of the very few industry categories where the job seeker to job rate is actually getting worse on us in this moment. So it has always felt hard to hire technical talent, but we see in the data it is actually getting harder right now to hire technical talent in terms of the supply and demand mismatch.
And do you see that at Etsy?
We do. And I think that so much of that actually lends into what we had discussed prior, which is this component of the economy itself. We talk about why is it that we have all of these roles. Developers have always been in demand. They continue to be in demand. But we're reaching this really strange place where there's a lot of hesitancy around even considering new roles. And should I jump into that?
Yeah. So how do you tackle that? Yeah.
Perfect. So first we'll start with, I think that it's really understandable. There have been so many layoffs. People are concerned about layoffs occurring at their own companies. And so we've been seeing more than ever before that we're actually having candidates who begin to consider roles and go all the way through the process only to say, I'm okay. I'm gonna stay where I am, right? And a lot of that, whereas before, of course, it's like maybe they got an offer for more money or a company maybe they valued more, and now it's more, I was interviewing because I thought maybe there'd be layoffs. There haven't been. Or we just had layoffs and I still have my job, so I'm good. And a lot of people don't want to be the last one and the first to go, right? So this has become more and more prominent, and we understand why. And so one of the big things that we've been doing with our candidates is just sort of being as transparent as humanly possible around what is the situation at our organization. Speak to the things that you talk about internally. Speak to the things that you talk about on financial calls with investors and with the public. What are the steps that we took during the pandemic that have helped us to be in a good place today? How do we determine which roles are still open? Most companies have either stopped hiring, or if they haven't stopped hiring, we haven't stopped hiring. You've reduced the roles you're hiring for. Explain, how did we choose these roles to be the ones that we're still hiring for? How are they essential to our business? And then candidates can make an informed decision that says, do I feel this risk is worth the potential reward of joining this organization?
Yeah. I mean, that's a sort of core theme, not only today, but anytime you work with developers or technical talent, it's like transparency.
Absolutely.
Transparency. Is there anything that you see in like job descriptions or as you hear from employers with regard to like what resonates with technical folks and what doesn't?
Well, maybe 2 points I'll make on that. One, one of the big investments that we make is Indeed, along with our sister company Glassdoor, is just providing transparency in all things workplace. And I think, coming out of COVID, a broader sort of macro trend that we see is people really do want to know, what is it like to work for this company? And so there's a lot of investment that we've made. For example, we have a work happiness score, which is actually the largest data set of workplace well-being indicators ever created. There's all kinds of research that's being done on it. But it's all kinds of dimensions of what is it actually like at this company beyond sort of the usual suspects of compensation, how much flexibility, et cetera. That said, compensation transparency, salary transparency, very hot topic right now, and something that we're driving across all jobs on Indeed. And we hear consistently from job seekers, pay is one of the most important things they want transparency into upfront, if possible, because it wastes both sides' time if you go all the way to the end and the pay expectations are not aligned, right? So that's something we're working on. I think as Indeed, as we try to attract talent, technical talent into our organizations, some of the things that we emphasize, stability obviously is really important, career development opportunities for learning and growth, mission, for us, our mission is to help people get jobs. We have huge commitments to society, and we do emphasize that. The ability to do really interesting, challenging work. We're a two-sided marketplace. People to jobs is a fabulously interesting optimization problem. It's a near real-time auction. It's got a lot of very cool elements to it. And then what is the culture of the place? So, generally, we have pretty good work-life balance and smart people and nice people. And so we can sort of tell that story. And that's part of us, trying to compete for talent vis-a-vis some of the other exciting companies that people are considering.
What you just said made me think a lot about how there are many articles and studies that show that Gen Z in particular really care about purpose, social good, mission-oriented companies. But sometimes I think people think that runs antithetical to the traditional developer. Do you find that developers care about purpose, that they care about social good, or is it tech stack, compensation, company financials?
It has to be both. Right? So we've seen specifically with developer talent that folks are saying to us, I would not even have considered applying to this company if I did not know that you had the right sort of mission, that you were investing in environmental impact in a positive way, that you were holding yourself to DEI goals, that were transparent, right? We're seeing that they're asking less about that during the process. They might ask immediately up front, but they come in saying, I know this about you already, I wouldn't have considered you otherwise. Or saying, tell me a little bit more about this. Okay, good, I'll keep on with it, right? But what we are seeing is that's sort of the barrier to entry. And then there are the questions that you spoke to, right? Which is, okay, what are the tech stacks I'm gonna be working with? What are the sorts of interesting projects I'm gonna be working on? How will that be seen within the company? Do people know what I'm working on? Do people see the outputs? Can I show the outputs to my friends? How tangible are they? Those are the things that we then begin to get these deeper questions around after we've passed that first really important component.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of candidates tell us that the choice of coming to Indeed was swayed by wanting to do something that they feel is going to make a bigger difference in the world. Yeah. And so I think for all organizations thinking about sort of what is your ESG or the broader mission or the broader purpose of your organization, and of course that takes many forms and flavors, but does that come across in your branding content, right? Like, does it come across on your website, on Indeed, on Glassdoor, on Stack Overflow? Like, does it come across? Are you telling that story to candidates? Because they actually are reading it. They really are thinking about it before they decide where to engage. So I think it's worth spending time on. I think one of the other pieces of advice I heard some marketers give is just like, look, Gen Z can smell inauthenticity a million miles away, so it has to be authentic. Like, you can't take a stock photo and be like, we do this too. It needs to be your own, authentic voice and all of that. perhaps an obvious statement, but it really does matter.
No, it's not obvious.
And what's so good about it is that's such an opportunity not only to like put forward an honest perception of the company, but this is part of what I love about employer brand in general is like this is such an opportunity to celebrate your people. Like what better way to demonstrate the reality of working at your organization than uplifting members of your team to speak about their impact in the organization, the projects they work on, the risks they take, and how that's been received by the business. Those are the sorts of things we put out into the world that we see perform on average 50 to 260% higher than industry standard, whether it's on Stack Overflow, LinkedIn, et cetera, right? Because it's just that they're the genuine stories from human beings of what they've experienced.
So, I mean, you're doing this right, obviously, because you just cited some impressive stats. So how have you gotten engineers and technologists bought into this process? And like, what are tangible ways that they've contributed to your efforts?
Oh, great questions. So we at Etsy actually have a blog called the Code is Craft blog. And a lot of people actually don't even know it's correlated to Etsy, but it is like our public-facing place where we say, here are some risks we took, here were the outputs, here's where we completely failed, here's where we pivoted, how we proceeded. So we already have a group of engineers who are comfortable sort of presenting like, these are my triumphs and my failures, and that's embraced internally. So like that's one group of people who we know we can always lean on is who are the people writing these pieces and sharing these pieces. We also are able to really engage with their leaders and say who are people who maybe are not up for a promotion today, or we aren't at the stage of the year where we're giving a raise, right? But you want to celebrate. They have something to say that is worth sharing that other people could benefit from. We lean on them in that way to make sure that we are choosing specifically in a way that is not biased and that's also celebrating the people in this unique way.
I love that. And just sort of thinking about that and the success of that blog, and going back to the first question, is this sort of always-on approach, right? Like at the beginning of the pandemic, there were certainly more layoffs than we had seen in 10 years or more, and then there have been lots of sort of ups and downs since then. Why does it matter that employers, whether or not they're hiring, engage with Glassdoor, that they continue posting to Code is Craft, that they continue investing in employer branding, for example?
Well, I think there are a lot of employers who realize, particularly when you're thinking about tech talent pipelines, it's hard to do cold starts, right? So you need to be thinking about the consideration of people at various stages in their careers, and obviously a lot of people who have been, I know you've been, on the TA side. You talk to sophisticated TA leaders in this, they are always thinking about a long game of people you're building relationships with, and in a long career, there might be somebody who's considering your company, it's not the right moment now, but in a few years, it could be. And so I think that's an important investment in your brand, with these, with this talent as it evolves. And I think also just recognizing that, reputation and people talking about what is a company really like, it's not just what you put out there, it's also the user-generated content, right? So that almost forces the authenticity, because if you have a interview process that really isn't something that people rate highly, it is going to come out, right? So thinking about what are people saying about the experience they have as a candidate, the experience they have as an employee, does come back and affect your ability to attract, whenever you are hiring again. So you need to be thinking about it on a continuum, I would argue.
And think about the way that folks even consider new jobs, right? Typically, if we're like, all right, I really want to start exploring new opportunities, you're not going to say, I'm going to go to a list of random companies and research every single one of them and figure out which one lands with me. You typically have what are the companies that I'm familiar with? What are the companies that I've heard good things about from my friends who work there? Or the companies that are making really positive impacts in the world that I'd love to be associated with in the work that I create, right? So that is the starting point. And then they go to Glassdoor and they say, what does this look like? Or they say, which best places to work lists are they on? And that is another way people find new companies, right? But generally, particularly developers, right? As we said, they're so in demand. They sort of have their pick of the litter. They're gonna begin with those companies that they have some sort of interest in, and that's been built over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a good sort of segue to thinking about, when times are bad, it makes sense to stay engaged, to stay ahead of the curve. But when times are really good, when we see a huge boom and a huge surge, what did you see on Indeed? Were people looking to new geos? Were they looking to non-traditional backgrounds? How are people, sort of attacking the war for talent in non-traditional ways?
Yeah, well, I think coming out of COVID, certainly many companies are embracing sort of flexibility, hybrid. It's not going away. So, how do you make that part of the way you work in a new way, recognizing that teams, if they're coordinating, still need some time zone coherence to be able to work effectively as teams. We definitely see trends towards people thinking about, broader international markets. That's about talent pools. It's also about risk mitigation in some cases for sort of follow the sun. And, I think there's just also a recognition that in some cases where there's a shortage, you need to, find people who have adjacent skills and then train them and upskill them. I know there's been a lot of conversation about learning, but we have people who have studied math in college who can transition into data science, and so there's a lot of that thinking that's gone on, and we see a lot of companies just realizing that can be a pretty effective way to navigate it.
And what about, it's a question for you, retention? Because the other way to help solve the talent shortage is to retain the employees that you have. How does what you do in the employer branding side sort of play into retention strategy, and how closely do you work with the people team on that?
So we work really, really closely with the people team, and that might be through the means of just speaking to what our initiatives are, right? Maybe making those more public facing. And I know that we'll talk a little bit more about learning and development and exactly what that looks like, but I think probably the key way that employer brand works with the retention component is that part that I mentioned earlier, which is it is an opportunity to celebrate your people in a really public facing way. Now, that's not everybody's MO. Not everybody wants to be celebrated in that specific way, but there are people that do, and that is also such a great stage for them when they think about their development within the organization. Are they someone that other peers are seeing on the screen, perhaps, right? Or being featured, and how does that look for future employers when they do eventually leave your company, because one day they will. Having that comfort and giving people those opportunities to share ideas does really help them feel valued in showing that we are invested in them in that short-term and long-term way.
Yeah, and you touched on L&D, and I'm curious for both of you, have you seen a shift? And sort of, job descriptions used to be very prescriptive. Here's what you're going to do. Maybe here's what the tech stack looks like. But have you seen the shift that's been talked about a lot today in terms of how companies are investing in growth, how the job itself provides opportunities to sort of stretch? What does that look like today?
Yeah, I think there's a broader recognition of the importance of sort of continuous learning and investment in learning, and how much people value career development, and what companies actually are investing in making sure that they're having those opportunities. I know as Indeed, we sort of recognize that it can't be one size fits all, though. You have people with such different preferences. So, for example, we have sort of mentorship or executive coaching, formal programs, tuition reimbursement, Udemy, licenses that people can do on their own. And so when you're emphasizing like, okay, we are invested in this, this is important to us, and here's some of the ways that we support, our technical talent with being able to develop and grow and refine their craft, it's important to put that forward. It shouldn't be like the 17th thing you say, right? It's making sure they know that that's all part of the plan, the package, when they're coming into an organization and the organization wants to invest in them. So I think we see a lot of companies thinking more broadly about how they do that, and then trying to put it more forward in the broader package of why you should choose my company as a place to grow your career.
And building on that, and also thinking of the Udemy presentation, which I really enjoyed because I think it showed sort of what this next step of learning and development has to look like to retain your talent, which is, I think before we kind of got away, maybe not the nicest way to put it, but we got away with saying like, we have all these really flashy, cool things that we can give you to progress in your career. And what we often see, and I've experienced this myself, is it's like, I have no idea where to start. Like, it's cool that I have all of these cool things to choose from, but like, what is actually the thing that I should focus on? And then not only what is the thing I should focus on, but then how do I track whether I am becoming more efficient in this thing? How can I apply it to my day-to-day? How can I make this a part of my specific outputs, right? And so we're actually going through that transition internally at Etsy now, which is we've created a new Pathways program where that's the intent is, let's make all of these resources more accessible. Let's make managers and employees reporting to them familiar with these resources in a similar way so that we can actually identify what do I need, what are the resources available for that specific development, and then how are we going to apply this to our day-to-day, our outputs in a way that is tangible, which also, by the way, helps with retention because you can see the impact of what you're doing. We're learning all of the time, but it's happening so quickly, particularly if you're someone like me who just jumps from like project to project to project. I usually don't remember to look back and be like, wow, I accomplished this thing and that was new and I'd never done this before. If you can work that into your learning and development programming and the way managers and employees speak to each other about it, it's so much more rewarding because you can feel it, you can see it, and you see the progress you're making to date.
Yeah, I mean, it's really insightful with regards to the future of learning. I want to sort of reground in employer branding in particular. I think back to like maybe 7-8 years ago, I was running marketing for a company, and it was really when people started to talk about this concept of employer branding. Glassdoor was fairly new, not super widely adopted. The Muse was just coming into
Muse
play.
was the only thing people knew.
Yeah, exactly. No one knew who to pay for it, marketing or HR. No one knew who owned it.
We still don't know.
We still don't know that. We know it. You know me. No, I'm kidding. And I think today people have sort of figured a lot of things out, but for technical teams in particular, not quite. So what advice would you give to a head of employer branding or a chief people officer when it comes to ensuring that their employer branding speaks to technical talent in particular?
Do you understand?
Well, I guess question number one is, do you have employer branding content that was designed to speak to technical talent? You know, it sort of comes up with like, I want to attract veterans. Great. Do you have any content that speaks specifically to veterans? And does it feel like it was tailored to that audience? So I think like step one is, have you taken sort of the time to think about, all right, well, what is our value proposition for technical talent? How is it very different from other roles in our organization? Bringing people in your company who can tell that story, you know, candidly and authentically, you know, that are in the technical organization speaking on behalf of it. And then let it shine, right? And let it be specifically for that audience. And you know, we've seen people do some very thoughtful things with making sure that the content that's showing up there is actually very purposely tailored to that audience. And I think that helps a lot. You know, is it perfect? No, like there's always evolution, but I think that that's like the first thing that I would say. If you haven't at least done that, start there.
And speaking with your people in the positions that you want to be hiring for and people who have been performing well, that for me was my starting point, right? So whether that was our Mexico market, when we began hiring in Mexico City, I went to our engineers and I said, what are we doing really well? Where are we not quite up to par? I really understood like where were we strong and where were we not, and that was the content that I developed. Also, your recruiters are a really good starting point. When I was looking at the data for like which of our campaigns were performing most effectively, which by the way, if you want an easy starting point, was what were the tech stacks you were using? What is your company's comfort level with taking risks and making mistakes? What are the interesting projects that you're working on? Those are like the key areas that my recruiters also said to me, that's what candidates are asking, that's what candidates want to know. So it shows in the data, but it also just shows in what your recruiters will say your talent is interested in. So start with the people on the team and the recruiters who talk to them all the time.
Great. So we're going to go to some audience questions. There's a good one to start. How do you overcome awareness issues when it comes to hiring for tech? So technologists, according to this person, lean towards traditional tech companies and sometimes don't even realize a company like Etsy has a tech role.
Everybody has tech roles now.
I deal with this all the time. This was like the big thing that I was asked of when I joined Etsy. It was like, we do all of this technical stuff. In fact, the majority of roles we hire for are engineering, development, product design. Like those are the roles we hire for. Those are the mass majority of our employees. So how do you overcome awareness issues when hiring for tech? One of our choices was actually starting to advertise on Stack Overflow, right? Because it's like we were doing this on LinkedIn and we most of us know the relationship with engineers and developers in LinkedIn. It works, we're making progress, but like this was a place people were really coming to learn and share ideas. And so it's how do we get in those places? The other big thing is really, really just encouraging your employees to share their stories more widely. This is something that I've done at the 2 companies where I've done employer brand. Like that was key. The Etsy logo, or any logo, is only ever going to be so strong. It is not a human being's face. And at the end of the day, I am not an engineer, right? I am not technical talent. I work in a tech company, but I'm not technical talent. So if you can encourage people and give direction around how they can share their stories more widely, their voices will always be more powerful than yours, always, because it is genuine, it is factual, and the people in their network are the people you're trying to attract.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of companies that try to compete for technical talent. You know, grocery, like pretty much every company, grocery, auto, like all these companies that aren't the traditional tech companies. And I think sometimes people don't appreciate the sophistication of the businesses and the complexity of the problems and how interesting they are.
Totally.
I think that one of the angles is just making sure your TA teams and your recruiters know how to convey to a person who appreciates this is going to be a fun problem to solve. The scope and scale of figuring out logistics in a global retailer is pretty cool. So, like that I think can also help with people being like, oh, I had no idea it was that big, that cool, that complex, that interesting, and can be something that piques people's interest.
Yeah, and beyond the sophistication, the sheer scale. Yeah. I mean, working at I think every bank would now say that they're a tech company for sure, but impacting millions and billions of people around the world. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. So another question is, what is needed to increase the number of female developers in the workforce? How can professionals, those who aren't in the higher education system, help encourage this?
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, you start.
Okay. I get so excited about this. So part of this actually stems from something that you mentioned earlier, which is we have seen factually that people from non-traditional backgrounds are doing phenomenally in development roles and other technical roles. It is now proven. It's no longer a question mark, right? And so creating, whether it's an internship or an apprenticeship program, both of which we have at Etsy, right? Like that's a really great way to begin to uplift this talent and bring them in. But part of it is also rethinking how you assess talent. There are a lot of companies that will do technical tests in the process that are intentionally or not really aligned with very specific educations, certain degrees, certain universities, and that's going to really disempower you from finding and empowering really very talented people from underrepresented communities in general, female and beyond. So sort of rethinking the way that you do that, creating technical challenges that are more aligned with actual projects your team would be working on, for instance, and also being very cognizant of how you can develop talent and things that you can invest in that will allow you to better develop talent. That helps open this up to ensure that you're bringing people in not only straight out of university, but career changers, people who do have applicable skills and have been learning this, whether they've been going to a boot camp or whether they haven't. These are all demographics of people who have the potential and have proven they can do this.
That's an awesome answer. And I feel like, we've all learned that a lot of the skills, like people have learned them over the last, they're learnable, and people, have a lot of transferable skills. So how are you as an organization thinking about people who are non-traditional coming in, learning the skills and investing in that? I think also just representation matters. Like you see companies that once they start to have more women, more diverse people in their organization, there's more diverse people coming into the organization because they see it and it begins to sort of turn the wheel. But it takes intentionality, right? And I think from college all the way up through the ranks.
Absolutely.
Well, that's both optimistic and actionable, so I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Sally and Maggie, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Khalid.